What kind of social justice is that, Matt? What kind of social justice to attack pensioners, to threaten their lives?
As one former Labour advisor just said, Brown destroyed our pension system. They did it before, they'll do it again. Labour always betray our...
And getting rid of winter fuel allowance for 10 million pensioners is the right thing to do.
Absolutely. It's
Why?
The best thing.
But ultimately, what they have done is a politics of cruelty against millions of pensioners.
Is Keir Starmer deliberately trying to destroy Britain's pensioners, or is he just that incompetent? That's the burning question on the minds of many as the Labour leader continues to bulldoze through policies that threaten to leave our elderly citizens out in the cold. Literally. The Labour Party leader is on a mission to show just how detached he is from the realities faced by the elderly in Britain. The decision to slash crucial support is not only heartless but a poor judgment and reckless policymaking. You know, typical Starmer stuff. Can Britain really afford Starmer's ridiculous plans, or is it time for a leader who actually values the people who built this nation? More importantly, what is this disastrous plan that has the entire nation seething? To answer these questions, let's go to where it all began when Starmer announced the cut on winter fuel payments.
I didn't want to means test the winter fuel payment, but it was a choice that we had to make. A choice to protect the most vulnerable pensioners while doing what is necessary to repair the public finances. Because pensioners also rely on a functioning NHS, good public transport, strong national infrastructure. They want their children to be able to buy homes. They want their grandchildren to get a good education. So we have made that difficult.
Speech of doom was where a ton of false promises were exposed. Among them was the fact that the Labour government is cutting the winter fuel allowance of pensioners. Remember the days when pensioners could rely on a little extra help during the winter months? Well, under Starmer's leadership, those days are gone. The decision to scrap winter fuel payments for millions of pensioners is a slap in the face to those who have spent their lives contributing to this country. Even worse was the fact that they lied in their manifesto. There was no mention of cutting the allowance. Watch what happened when a reporter confronted him on shady politics.
You've got off to a bad start with pensioners who voted for you, and then you cut their winter fuel allowance, and it wasn't in your manifesto. You also said in the general election you had no plans to raise taxes beyond what you'd set out in your manifesto. Now you're saying something else. So can you please level...
They lied about it in their manifesto to gain support, and then they took a complete U-turn. This isn't the first time Starmer's leadership has been called into question. From flip-flopping on key issues to failing to connect with voters, his time as Labour leader has been marked by a series of blunders that have left even his supporters scratching their heads. And now, with the decision to cut winter fuel payments, he's managed to alienate one of the most reliable voting blocs in the country. Good job, Keir. Unsurprisingly, this move has sparked outrage across the country. Here's what one of many pensioners had to say about this.
Voters are waking up to the reality of Sir Keir Starmer and co. saying one thing before the election and doing something completely different now they're in power.
I'm a staunch Labour voter, and I was ashamed to see a Labour government hit the poorest people the most.
Imagine working your entire life, paying your taxes, and hoping the government would take care of you when you're too old to work. And boom, this is what you see unfold. What's worse is that this comes from the self-proclaimed champion of social justice. What sort of justice is there to put countless helpless pensioners at risk? Most of them are too old to work, and without the winter fuel allowance, they'll freeze. Of course, this will hit the lower class the most and is a direct betrayal from the Labour government. Pensioners are a key demographic, and they have long memories. Starmer's betrayal will not be forgotten anytime soon.
This year, he went on Good Morning Britain and said Labour would save you 400 quid on your bills. In June this year, he said again that Labour would cut bills, create jobs and provide energy security. In Parliament, he hammered the Tories for even thinking about cutting the winter fuel payments for pensioners.
Last year, the Prime Minister was apparently drawing up plans to remove the winter fuel allowance from pensioners. So will he now rule out taking pensioners' winter fuel payments off them to help fund his £46 billion black hole?
Then people voted for him, he won the election, and this happens. He cuts winter fuel payments for the elderly. They now face, many of them, a choice between heating and...
Labour government, led by Keir Starmer, is intent on behaving like a toxic ex. They promised a ton of things and they delivered absolutely none. What's important to note here is the blatant hypocrisy. He blasted the previous government for suggesting this plan, and now, barely a few months into office, he's adopted those very plans. As if that wasn't enough, there are even taxes on pensions now. Let's take a closer look at his speech at the Parliament to witness a masterclass in hypocrisy.
But pensioners and those who are planning their retirement deserve better than his contempt for their questions. Because if £46 billion were cut from its funding, the value of the state pension would almost halve. So I don't apologise for asking on their behalf again whether he will finally rule out cutting their state pension to fulfil the enormous black hole in his spending plans.
Pensioners definitely deserve better, but Sir Keir, who's the contemptuous one now? To be fair, he does offer a rationale for this move, but it's utterly ridiculous. He claims that resources need to be focused on those who need them most. But who could possibly need help more than our elderly population, many of whom have paid into the system their entire lives? This decision isn't just out of touch, it's downright dangerous. The National Energy Action charity has warned that cutting winter fuel payments could lead to a spike in winter deaths among pensioners, a grim statistic that will forever be linked to Starmer's name. To nobody's surprise, this was all predicted by the previous government.
Labour that always hits pensioners hard. It's his mentors, Blair and Brown, that broke their promises, raised pension taxes by £118 billion and delivered an insulting 75p rise in the state pension. As one former Labour advisor just said, Brown destroyed our pension system. They did it before, they'll do it again. Labour always betray our...
They did it, and they are doing it again. It's comical how accurately Rishi Sunak predicted what was going to happen. In the past, the Labour government utterly destroyed the pension system, amounting to only a measly 75p increase in pensions. What'll happen now? The same, if not worse. They'll scrap the benefits for the old folk, burden them with taxes, and completely ruin many lives. But this highlights a bigger problem, a pattern of lies that the Labour government has sold. They wanted to be elected, and now they're going back on all of their promises.
This happens like this, but then I remember Starmer standing up in the House of Commons doing numerous interviews that he was going to be the custodian and the champion of pensioners and, you know, make sure that winter fuel payments are part of all of that. They went back on their promise, and it was a big one, because Labour have been spending the last 14 years, in a lot of cases quite rightly, campaigning against austerity. What they're doing now is austerity.
It is punishment for trusting them. It's understandable that they've just gotten to power and can't bring change overnight. However, it is deeply concerning when they're taking steps in the wrong direction at every possible moment. Things aren't looking good for Starmer, as he's continuously going back on his promises. Sure, the nation's economy is in a horrible state, but address the root causes, mate. Don't punish the old folk for it, they're the most vulnerable ones. If this critique seems unfair, see, politicians are still being paid for their energy bills. If they wanted to cut costs, that should have been the obvious and better option.
Again, it's a reason why people have switched off on politics, because they're telling them we've got to do this and tighten our belts, and there's a black hole of 20 million, and meanwhile, you're getting train drivers who are already on huge salaries getting potential big pay rises, MPs getting pay rises, MPs still getting their energy costs paid for by the taxpayer, and meanwhile, we're facing the biggest tax burden since 1948, and no wonder hunters around the country are going, this isn't working.
Does this black hole in the economy only exist for the working class, average British citizens? Meanwhile, the MPs are reaping the benefits of taxpayer dollars, and unions are taking huge pay raises. Conservative MPs have been quick to condemn Starmer's financial assault on pensioners, with many predicting that this could be the final nail in the coffin for Labour's hopes in the next general election. And they're not wrong. Naturally, after the backlash, the Labour government and their supporters are doing damage control. Needless to say, it isn't going well.
I don't know if you noticed, but when Sir Keir Starmer announced that he was going to take away the energy bills help, the winter fuel allowance from 10 million pensioners, a lot of people said, well, that ain't fair. What are you doing? You can't do that. And it seems to me, after the backlash, he's now pointing out that there's a pension credit scheme and that more pensioners should actually use it if they need it, a scheme that's always existed. One assumes that that is just a little bit of damage control and post-announcement spin.
As is often the case with the voices of reason have been ignored in favor of a misguided sense of righteousness, how easily they ask people to resort to credit schemes while destroying their chances of survival during the winter. First off, there's no awareness or education on how to avail of the credit scheme. Secondly, do we really expect old people to jump through the bureaucratic hoops? Most of them are too old for all that effort and just want to live their lives. What's worse is the Labour government thinks Conservatives should support their decision to scrap the winter fuel payments.
It's not the right thing to do. It's very, very clearly attempting to score cheap points over the Labour Party as opposed to putting forward the national interest, which is what a proper party would be doing. They should be backing the measures that Labour is making that are tough.
You believe
not
the tough measures, as you call them, and getting rid of winter fuel allowance for 10 million pensioners is the right thing to do?
Absolutely.
They're not just cutting back costs, they're doing so at the expense of lives. Of course, people are criticising it, as they should. The excuse of putting national interest above everything doesn't work when you realise that these old folk are a part of this nation. Do their lives and safety don't count as a national interest anymore? Here's another supporter of this insane idea trying to gaslight a Conservative into supporting it. Needless to say, it doesn't end well for him.
That you would prioritise what in your language would be handouts to pensioners rather than paying hard-working train drivers what they merit.
What a load of rubbish, honest to God. It's not a handout to give a pensioner their pension. They've been paying...
It's what you would call it.
No, it's not, because they've been paying national insurance for the last 50 years. They've paid into the system.
Yes, exactly. That is the definition of someone being out of touch with reality. It's not just about the money, either. The winter fuel payment has long been a symbol of the government's commitment to looking after its older citizens. By scrapping it, Starmer is sending a clear message pensioners are no longer a priority. This move is not just bad policy, it's bad politics. The elderly vote matters, and it's clear that Starmer has taken it for granted. Watch this next clip where this guy tries to argue that pensioners don't need the extra money in the most disgusting way possible.
So if you look at the bottom quintile of pensioners, they spend 17.8% of their income on hotels, restaurants, cigarettes and alcohol. That's the equivalent of £2,100 for them. If you take away the £200 winter fuel allowance from those people, they would only have to cut that expenditure, which could only be described as leisure expenditure, by 10%.
Now that is
when one of your texters talks about heating or eating, I don't believe he's telling the truth. And for those tiny minority...
There are a number of people who find that...
Is that an outrageous thing to say? Or just downright disgusting? To argue that people who've worked their entire lives do not need assistance from the government is ludicrous. Even if they spend it on luxuries, which isn't true by any stretch of the imagination, they have the right to do so. If the government can spend on the energy bills of MPs, they can and should help the pensioners. Watch this nonsensical argument being completely debunked.
But, there's a lot of wastage there, and some of the wealthy pensioners don't need it. That's not true. I mean, I've read some articles whereby over 2 million pensioners losing that allowance is the difference between almost eating and heating.
Wow.
Not everyone's within their threshold.
Yeah.
And it's a nefarious policy by the Labour government. They're trying to roll back a bit and muddy the waters and so on. But ultimately, what they have done is a politics of cruelty against millions of pensioners.
Using a few wealthy people to punish millions of other pensioners is truly cruel. There are millions of people. As the temperatures drop and pensioners across the country struggle to keep warm, they will remember who was responsible. They will remember the man who promised to stand up for ordinary people, only to abandon them when they needed him most. And when the next election comes around, they will make their voices heard.
As it's only going to be a small amount of that money which is taxable, isn't it? So, I mean, it's going to be a modest demand, if nothing else.
It's still a demand, though, isn't it? And a lot of people will be panicking, and a lot of people will be saying, look, we're hard up enough as it is. And to have this taxation based on what is still a I mean, what is the state pension? It depends how old you are, but it's between about 11,000 and 13,000 a year. It's not a huge amount of money.
It doesn't matter if it's a small amount of tax. They are still taxing the hard-earned pensions of seniors. Imagine being taxed your entire life just to be treated like this by the government and have people justifying it. Things will only get worse, as this is indicative of a broader problem with Starmer's economic policies. His plan is not only that pensioners should not get any benefits, they should be taxed on top of that.
They're being taxed on their income, which includes the state pension and also money that they get through doing part-time jobs, whatever it may be, and also their own private pensions. So what the point is that tax band, because of the gradual rise in income, including the state pension, is catching 140,000 more people, and they will for the first time get this.
Farmer's assault on pensioners doesn't stop with winter fuel payments. His broader economic policies reveal a worrying disregard for the challenges faced by older Britons. Under his leadership, Labour has flirted with ideas like wealth taxes and pension reforms that could further erode the financial security of retirees. It's as if Starmer is determined to squeeze every last penny out of the very people who have worked hard and saved diligently their entire lives.
The net zero madness that this government is going to impose on us is going to push bills up. Not only that, they also stopped drilling new oil. They've got rid of all of that policy, so cheap fuel is no longer available. And so rather than this being a sensible transition, if we're going to do it, let's be sensible about it, we're now going to punish the most impoverished in our society in order to have this grand plan for GB energy, which is obviously now punishing pensioners first. So let your nan freeze. That's what Keir Starmer wants.
With energy prices already sky high and no sign of relief in sight, this move is set to push us all into even greater hardship. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of all this is Starmer's sheer audacity. Despite the widespread backlash from pensioners, advocacy groups, and even members of his own party, he has remained stubbornly committed to his course. It's a level of arrogance that would be impressive if it weren't so damaging. Sadly, this has real, far-reaching consequences. Here's one senior who's on a hunger strike until this madness ends.
Now, you're going to stay on hunger strike until when?
I'm going to stay on hunger strike until the government see common sense. No, James, I also want the winter fuel supplement returning to the old age pensioners, no questions asked. That was disgusting. The man made promises before the election. He hasn't honoured the promises that he made.
He has the right to demand common sense from the government. Let's take a look at the cold, hard facts. Energy prices have surged by over 54% in the past year alone, and pensioners who often rely on fixed incomes are feeling the squeeze more than anyone. The removal of winter fuel payments, which provided up to PS 3000 per household, will leave many pensioners struggling to heat their homes. This is not just an inconvenience, it's a crisis.
How do you feel about him doing this? What's your name, by the way?
My name's Pauline, so it's Paul and Paulie.
Pauline, what do you feel about him doing this? You must be worried.
Well, I am very, very, very worried, but Paul is a very determined man.
Can see that, yeah.
So, at this moment in time, he's doing what he thinks is correct, and he feels strongly.
Just look at that old man. No wonder his wife is worried beyond measure. But this raises the question, when will Starmer and his government listen to their worries? It's an absolute disgrace to our nation that we're punishing the most vulnerable among us. According to Age UK, around 1.5 million older people are already living in fuel poverty, and this number is expected to soar as a result of Labour's misguided policies. So what is Starmer prioritising over pensioners? The union workers, of course.
But they're saying, Keir Starmer's sold out to the unions, and he's putting unions and strikers before pensioners. What do you say to that?
I accept, to start with, that there is a risk, and I hope it's a small risk, that this could spiral out of control with a domino effect, and no one wants...
Oh, it is spiralling out of control already. Starmer has cited the need to target support more effectively, but it's hard to see this as anything other than an excuse to balance the books at the expense of the elderly. In the end, Keir Starmer's legacy might be one of failure. He has failed to connect with voters, failed to provide a coherent vision for the future, and now he has failed to protect the most vulnerable members of our society.
I think the Labour
You're on
government...
£11.5 grand.
The new Labour government in the first 6 weeks has just acted in such a disgusting manner. What a pernicious way to go about saying Keir Starmer, when he got in, said, I represent everybody, not just those who voted for us, but those who don't. It's largely believed that those who don't are pensioners. A lot of pensioners don't, because they've seen the problems that former Labour governments have brought to this country. What's the first thing they do? The most nasty and pernicious piece of legislation I can remember in all the years I've been in journalism: take £300 away from those who are most vulnerable in our society.
We all want what's best for this nation. We all wanted this government to succeed. Because at the end of the day, we're citizens of this great nation. However, despite giving Starmer the benefit of the doubt, things are looking bleak. He went back on his promises. He proved himself to be a hypocrite. And now, he's making horrible policy decisions for the pensioners. Not only is he stripping them off their earned benefits, including the winter fuel payments, but he's also looking to tax their pensions. This is not an error, it's a moral failing. When the time comes to cast their votes, the pensioners will remember who left them out in the cold. If the government has failed to protect them, at least we can do our part. Help us spread the truth by liking this video and subscribing to the channel.